When President Donald Trump walks into CIA headquarters unannounced, no one is prepared for what comes next. As he drops a folder filled with shocking classified evidence, the room falls silent. Corruption is about to be exposed, and traitors are running out of time. What happens next will change the course of American history forever. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The morning air over Langley, Virginia was dense with tension, a thick fog rolling in over CIA headquarters, as if the very atmosphere knew something monumental was about to unfold. Inside the towering fortress-like structure, the most elite minds of the intelligence community gathered in the main briefing room, their murmurs subdued, their expressions laced with uncertainty. Something was off. A presidential visit was not unheard of, but unannounced, with zero media presence, a total security lockdown, and whispers of classified files being pulled from the deepest archives. This wasn't routine. This was something else entirely. Then the silence broke. The unmistakable roar of an armored motorcade sent a ripple of apprehension through the building. Black SUVs and military escorts sliced through the early morning mist, moving with deliberate precision toward the CIA's main entrance. Agents rushed to their positions, fingers brushing their sidearms, ready for anything. And then, as the first car door swung open, he stepped out. President Donald J. Trump. Dressed in a crisp, dark suit, a determined scowl on his face, he moved with authority, not as a guest, but as a man on a mission. He wasted no time with small talk, his steel-moo gaze sweeping over the agents who stood frozen at attention. The mere weight of his presence sent a current of unease rippling through the ranks of intelligence officers who had spent years operating behind closed doors, unchallenged, unseen. But today, the shadows would be exposed. Trump did not shake hands. He did not acknowledge their titles or their ranks. Instead, he walked with purpose through the labyrinthine halls of the most secretive agency in the world, flanked by a team of his most trusted security personnel. His destination? The CIA's main operations room, the heart of American intelligence. Inside, high-ranking officials, some of whom had served through multiple presidencies, waited. General Caldwell, the grizzled veteran with decades of intelligence experience, stood at the center, his posture rigid, his eyes unreadable. Around him, top analysts, field operatives, and department heads exchanged anxious glances. Something was wrong. Without warning, Trump entered the room. The air shifted. His presence demanded attention, commanding, forceful, inescapable. He walked to the head of the table, set down a thick leather-bound folder, and looked each person in the eye. His voice was cold, firm, and final. This isn't just a visit. A beat of silence. No one moved. Then, he continued, his voice unwavering, this is an investigation. The entire room froze. Heartbeats accelerated. Even the most seasoned officials, men and women who had stared down world leaders, who had uncovered national security threats, who had directed covert missions in hostile territories, suddenly felt an unfamiliar chill creep down their spines. Trump's hands rested on the thick folder before him, his fingers drummed slowly, deliberately against the leather cover. He let the anticipation build, let the weight of his next words settle into their very bones. Then he dropped the bombshell. For years, America has been betrayed from within. Some of the people in this very room have sold out our country. The words sliced through the air like a guillotine, leaving a deafening silence in their wake. That ends today. A murmur rippled through the room. Glances were exchanged, nervous swallows, hands clenched into fists beneath the polished table. Then, before anyone could speak, Trump flipped open the folder. The moment the first page was exposed, the weight of reality hit the room like a hammer. Inside that folder was proof, names, financial transactions, hidden communications, unmistakable evidence of treason. Trump's sharp gaze cut through them like a blade. Let's begin. A suffocating silence hung in the CIA's main operations room, the kind that made the air feel heavier, the walls closer. President Donald J. Trump stood at the head of the long, polished conference table, his expression unreadable. Across from him, a room filled with America's top intelligence officials, some of them sweating, others desperately trying to mask their discomfort. The thick leather-bound folder sat open before him, filled with classified intelligence reports, financial transactions, and evidence that no one in that room thought would ever see the light of day. "What you see here," Trump began, flipping to the next page, "is proof." He held up a confidential document stamped with multiple security clearances, revealing a list of names. Officials who had been leaking intelligence, funding foreign adversaries, and compromising the very safety of the United States. Murmurs spread across the table. Some officers shifted uncomfortably, others clenched their fists. General Caldwell, standing near Trump's right, narrowed his eyes, his expression darkening. "Mr. President," Caldwell spoke, his voice gravelly and firm, "are you certain about these accusations?" Trump turned his icy gaze to the general, flipping another page. "Beyond certain." He placed a specific file in front of Caldwell. It bore the name of Deputy Director Samuel Grayson, one of the most respected men in the agency. Grayson's jaw tightened. He leaned forward slightly, but Trump beat him to it. "You've been working against us," Trump said, his voice even. "You funneled intelligence reports to foreign agents. You manipulated missions to favor private interests." A gasp rippled through the room. Grayson's face turned pale, a bead of sweat forming on his temple. "Mr. President," he started, his voice a whisper, "I don't know where you're getting this from, but don't." Trump's tone was absolute, sharp as a knife. "I have bank statements, wire transfers. I have intercepted communications. You sold us out, Grayson." The deputy director's fingers twitched. His entire career, his entire carefully constructed web of deception, was unraveling before his very eyes. General Caldwell, still standing, studied Grayson with a look of pure disgust. "You've betrayed this country," Caldwell growled. "You sat across from us for years, pretending to be loyal, while you stabbed us in the back." Grayson's breathing grew heavier. The walls of the room seemed to close in. "You have nothing on me," he snapped, his desperation now evident. Trump smirked. "Is that so?" He motioned toward the large screen mounted on the wall behind him. A security officer pressed a button, and suddenly the entire room was flooded with damning evidence. Emails, phone conversations, meetings held in foreign embassies, and then the final blow. A video recording. Grayson's own voice echoed through the speakers. "The president is a problem. We have to contain him. If he keeps digging, we have no choice but to remove him." The room erupted. Gasps, exclamations. Someone cursed under their breath. Grayson's entire body stiffened. His hands trembled slightly before he balled them into fists. He knew there was no way out of this. Trump's expression hardened. "Effective immediately, Samuel Grayson is relieved of duty," Trump declared. "And he will be taken into custody under suspicion of treason." Two security officers moved in. Grayson lunged back, eyes darting around the room for an escape. "You think you can take me down like this?" he bellowed. "You don't understand how deep this goes." "Oh, I do," Trump said, folding his arms. "That's why I'm just getting started." The guards grabbed Grayson by the arms, but he still struggled, his face contorted with rage and fear. "This won't stop, Mr. President," he snarled as he was dragged toward the door. "There are people more powerful than you. You're playing a game you can't win." Trump stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. "The only ones who can't win," he said, voice calm, "are the ones caught lying to the American people." The door slammed shut behind Grayson. The room remained frozen. Some of the officers looked shaken, others angry. Trump let the silence settle before turning his attention back to the table. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he reached for another file. "Now," he said, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Who's next?" A flicker of panic spread across the remaining officers. Trump had only begun to expose the rot. There were more names, more traitors. One of them, Mark Lawson, sat 3 seats down, trying his best to look calm. But Trump had already noticed the beads of sweat forming at his brow. Trump turned his full attention to him. "Mr. Lawson," he said, sliding a page forward, "would you like to explain why your signature is on multiple intelligence authorizations connected to offshore accounts?" Lawson swallowed hard. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the document. "Sir, save it." Trump's voice was cold, final. "You funneled money out of this agency, disguised as mission funds, but in reality you were funding private contractors and foreign interests." Lawson's lips parted slightly, his mind scrambling for a way out. "You've been exposed," Trump continued, "and you're going to answer for it." Lawson's hands clenched into fists under the table. His world was crumbling. The agent standing near the door received a signal from General Caldwell. Within seconds, they moved in. Lawson shot up from his seat, chair scraping against the floor. "No, wait," he barked. "This is a mistake." Trump shook his head. The mistake was thinking no one would ever find out. The guard seized him. Lawson's desperate protests echoed through the hall as he was dragged away, just like Grayson before him. Trump watched it all, then turned back to the remaining officials. His gaze was sharp, calculated. He tapped the folder on the table. "I suggest if anyone else has something to confess, they do it now." The room remained dead silent. Not a single officer dared to speak. Trump leaned forward slightly. "Then let's continue." A heavy silence had settled over the room. The 2 men who had once commanded power, Deputy Director Samuel Grayson and Mark Lawson, had been dragged away, their desperate protests echoing in the hallways of CIA headquarters. But President Donald Trump was far from finished. He knew there were more. Trump sat at the head of the long mahogany table, the confidential folder still open before him. His fingers tapped rhythmically against the cover, his sharp eyes scanning the room like a predator sizing up its prey. The officials seated before him knew they were being hunted. "Now," Trump said, his voice calm but heavy with authority, "shall we keep going?" Several men and women shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some averted their eyes, staring down at the table as though they could will themselves invisible. But one man in particular caught Trump's attention. James Callahan, the president's own national security advisor. A man who had built a reputation as one of the most loyal, unwavering figures in Trump's administration. But Trump had learned the hard way. Sometimes, the most dangerous traitors were the ones who stood closest to you. Trump reached for another document, flipping it open with deliberate slowness. "James," he said, his voice dangerously casual. Callahan's head snapped up, his face rigid. "Sir," he responded, trying to maintain his composure. Trump held up a classified memo with Callahan's signature stamped at the bottom. "I have a question for you," Trump continued, placing the memo on the table and sliding it forward. Callahan didn't move. "Would you like to explain," Trump asked, "why your authorization is on a series of intelligence operations that funneled national security funds into private accounts overseas?" The entire room froze. A single bead of sweat trailed down Callahan's temple. "Sir," Callahan said carefully, "this is a misunderstanding. Those operations were strictly classified. I was following orders." Trump tilted his head slightly. "Following whose orders?" Callahan hesitated. That single moment of hesitation was all Trump needed. He had him. Trump exhaled sharply and leaned back in his chair. He glanced at General Caldwell, who stood by his side, his arms crossed, his face like granite. Then, Trump smirked. "I'll tell you exactly whose orders you were following." Callahan's fingers twitched. Trump reached into the folder and pulled out a second set of documents, this time a series of encrypted emails, messages that had been intercepted by a loyal intelligence officer within the NSA. He tossed them onto the table. The entire room leaned in. Trump's voice dropped to a deadly whisper. "You weren't following orders from the United States government. You were following orders from foreign operatives." The air was sucked out of the room. Someone cursed under their breath. Even those who had remained silent up until this point visibly recoiled at the accusation. Callahan's jaw clenched. "That's absurd, Mr. President." Trump's eyes darkened. "Is it?" He gestured toward the documents. "Because according to these, you've been coordinating intelligence leaks with operatives in China and Russia for years." A collective gasp rippled through the intelligence officers. Callahan gritted his teeth. "Those reports are fake." Trump chuckled. "Oh, they're very real." He motioned to a nearby officer who stepped forward and placed a flash drive on the table. Trump picked it up, turning it over in his hand before sliding it toward Callahan. "This drive contains recordings of your phone conversations," Trump said. "Every deal you made, every mission you sabotaged, every piece of information you sold." Callahan's face turned ghostly white. "Mr. President, you don't understand." "I understand just fine." Trump slammed his hands down on the table, his patience running out. Callahan flinched. Trump's voice was like steel. "You betrayed this country. You betrayed the people who trusted you, and you did it for money. You sold out the United States to our enemies." For the first time, Callahan looked afraid. His fingers curled into tight fists, his knuckles turning white. The room watched in stunned silence, waiting for what would happen next. Then, in a move no one expected, Callahan lunged. He bolted from his chair, reaching into his jacket. A gun. Chaos exploded. Shouts filled the room. Chairs scraped against the floor. Secret Service agents reacted in an instant, weapons drawn. Callahan gritted his teeth, his gun aiming for Trump. And then, bang, a single gunshot rang out. Callahan's body jerked back. His gun clattered to the floor. He stood there for a second, stunned, his breath ragged, a red stain spreading across his suit. Then he collapsed. The room was dead silent. Trump stood still, his expression unreadable. A Secret Service agent holstered his weapon, stepping forward to check Callahan's pulse. He shook his head. "He's dead, sir." A slow exhale filled the room. Trump straightened his tie, then turned to the remaining intelligence officers, his gaze sweeping over them. He let the silence linger. Then, "Does anyone else want to make a move?" No one spoke. No one dared to. Trump picked up the flash drive that had slid onto the floor in the chaos. He dusted it off, then placed it neatly back onto the table. He looked at the officers still seated. This is what happens when you betray your country. A deadly silence filled the room. And for the first time, Trump could see it in their eyes. Fear, not fear of him, fear of the truth. Because this was only the beginning. And Donald J. Trump was just getting started. The air inside CIA headquarters was suffocating, heavy with the stench of treason and fear. James Callahan, a man who had once stood beside President Donald Trump, was now lying lifeless on the cold marble floor. A traitor unmasked and silenced by his own desperation. But Trump knew this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. The room was frozen in place. The intelligence officers, men and women who had dedicated their lives to the security of the United States, sat in stunned silence. The world they thought they knew was crumbling before them. Then Trump spoke. "Clean this up," he ordered, his voice devoid of emotion. The Secret Service agents moved swiftly, securing Callahan's body, making sure no loose ends remained. Trump adjusted his cufflinks, his expression unreadable. He had walked into the belly of the beast, and now he had full control of the room. But General Caldwell was watching him carefully. The seasoned military leader stepped forward, his jaw tight, his gaze unreadable. "Mr. President," he said, his tone measured, "that was one battle, but this war isn't over." Trump turned to him, his stare unwavering. "I know," he replied, before reaching for another file. "That's why we're not stopping now." The folder in Trump's hands was thicker than the rest. It contained documents, hundreds of them. Intelligence reports, financial records, surveillance footage, proof of a conspiracy that ran deeper than anyone in this room had ever imagined. Trump placed the folder on the table and let it sit there, untouched, like a loaded weapon. "The corruption didn't start with Callahan," he said slowly, "and it sure as hell doesn't end with him." The room remained silent. Then from the far end of the conference table, a chair scraped against the floor. A man stood up, Deputy Director Samuel Grayson. His gray suit was immaculate, his hair perfectly combed, but there was something in his eyes, something that made Trump tense. "Mr. President," Grayson said, his voice calm, "I think we should all take a moment to breathe. What just happened here was regrettable." He placed his hands on the table, his fingers pressing into the polished surface. "We need to be careful." Trump's gaze narrowed. "Careful of what?" Grayson gave a slow, calculated smile. "Of how we proceed." A sharp silence fell over the room. The remaining CIA officers looked between Grayson and Trump as if they sensed something brewing. Then, Grayson did something unexpected. He sat down. "You're looking for traitors," he said smoothly. "But what if I told you that you're looking in the wrong place?" Trump's fingers tapped against the table, his patience wearing thin. Grayson leaned forward. "You're assuming that the corruption is limited to a few bad actors, that Callahan was the top of the chain. But what if I told you it goes higher?" Trump didn't blink. "How high?" Grayson exhaled. "Sir," he said, lowering his voice, "higher. Then you're prepared to go." The room was motionless. Trump glanced at General Caldwell, who was already clenching his fists. Something wasn't right. Grayson was too calm, too sure of himself. "You're stalling," Trump said flatly. "Why?" Grayson's smile faltered. "Because, Mr. President." He sat back in his chair, his hands folding together. "If you go any further, you're not just taking down rogue agents. You're taking down the entire system." The words hung in the air, heavy and cold. Trump's jaw clenched. He wasn't afraid of exposing corruption. But this was different. This was Grayson warning him, or threatening him. Trump reached for the folder again, flipping open a page. And then his blood ran cold. There it was, a single document, buried among the intelligence reports. A sealed memo, marked with a presidential clearance code. The name at the top, James Callahan. But the signature at the bottom wasn't Callahan's. It was Grayson's. Trump's eyes lifted slowly. Grayson was still smiling. "You see, Mr. President," he said, leaning in, "this isn't a battle you can win with a press conference. You think you've uncovered everything, but the real players? They're still in the shadows." Trump closed the folder. He knew what Grayson was doing. He was testing him, trying to see if Trump would blink first. But Trump didn't blink. He stood up. The entire room followed suit. "Let me make one thing very clear," Trump said, his voice steady but filled with unshakable authority. "I don't back down, I don't fold under pressure, and I don't lose." Grayson's smirk disappeared. "Your move, Grayson." And then Trump turned to his security detail. "Take him." Grayson's face finally changed. For the first time, he looked nervous. "Wait." 2 Secret Service agents moved in. Grayson stiffened, his fingers twitching, like he was considering making a move. But then, he exhaled and lifted his hands, surrendering. The entire room was deathly silent as Grayson was led out, his footsteps echoing in the hallway. And then it hit them. It was over. The CIA, the most powerful intelligence agency in the world, had just been purged from within. Trump turned back to the room. A long, tense pause followed. Then, General Caldwell stepped forward. "What now, sir?" Trump exhaled, rolling his shoulders. He glanced at the remaining loyal officers, the ones who had risked everything to fight for the truth. Then, he smiled. "Now," he said, adjusting his tie, "now we rebuild." And with that, Donald J. Trump had done the impossible. He had walked into the most fortified intelligence agency in the world, and walked out with it in his hands. The weight of the moment still lingered in the air as Deputy Director Samuel Grayson was led out in handcuffs. His footsteps echoed through the hall, a haunting sound in the silence that filled the CIA headquarters. Every officer in the room was holding their breath, some still frozen in shock, others whispering among themselves, struggling to comprehend what had just happened. President Donald Trump stood at the head of the long conference table, arms folded, his expression unreadable. He had done the unthinkable. He had walked into the heart of the intelligence community and rooted out the traitors hiding in plain sight. Grayson had fallen. Callahan was dead. And yet, Trump knew it wasn't over, because there was still one name left. Trump turned his gaze toward General Caldwell, his most trusted military leader, the man who had stood by him through every crisis, who had helped him navigate the chaos of Washington's deep state corruption. But as Trump looked into Caldwell's eyes, he saw something unsettling. Uncertainty. Caldwell was hiding something. Trump's fingers tightened around the folder in his hands. The last of the intelligence reports, the final piece of the puzzle, the moment of truth. He exhaled sharply. "General," he said, his voice steady, measured, "there's something you're not telling me." Caldwell's jaw tensed. "Sir, we've done enough for one day. We should regroup, take a moment to process." "No," Trump cut in, his voice like steel. "We do this now." He tossed the final file onto the table. A single sheet of paper slid out. Caldwell's eyes flickered toward it, but he didn't move. The tension in the room was suffocating. The remaining CIA officers sat motionless, their eyes darting between the president and the general. No one spoke. No one dared to breathe. Finally, Caldwell reached forward and flipped the paper over. And then, he went still. His fingers, usually steady as iron, trembled ever so slightly. His throat moved as he swallowed, but his face remained unreadable. Trump watched him carefully. "Say something, General," he demanded. Caldwell finally met Trump's gaze, and what Trump saw sent a chill down his spine. Regret. A cold realization settled over him. "You knew." Caldwell's lips parted, as if he wanted to speak, but he hesitated. That was all the confirmation Trump needed. "How long?" Trump asked, his voice quieter now, but no less dangerous. "How long have you known?" Caldwell took a slow, measured breath. "Since the beginning." The room exploded in hushed gasps. Trump's hands curled into fists. "Since the beginning?" he repeated. Caldwell exhaled, finally looking away. "I didn't think it would come to this." Trump felt a surge of anger like he had never known before. This was the man he had trusted, the one he had relied on, the one he believed was on his side. And all along, he had been compromised. "You let it happen." Caldwell looked back at him, his face drawn, his voice heavy with something that almost sounded like sorrow. "I tried to contain it." "Contain it?" Trump's voice rose now, the fire burning in his chest. "People died, Caldwell. The country was being sold off, piece by piece, and you—" "What? Looked the other way?" Caldwell didn't flinch. "It wasn't that simple, Mr. President." Trump slammed his fist against the table, causing the remaining officers to flinch. "It's always that simple?" Caldwell shook his head. "You don't understand what we were up against." Trump took a step forward. "Then tell me." Caldwell exhaled through his nose, his shoulders heavy with the weight of something long buried. "They were too powerful, too deep. If I had fought them head on, they would have destroyed everything. So I waited. I played along. I thought—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "I thought I could stop it from the inside." Trump's jaw tightened. "And yet here we are." Silence. Caldwell's hands slowly curled into fists at his sides. "Do what you have to do, Mr. President." The words were almost a whisper, but they rang loud and clear. Trump took a deep breath. He looked at his security detail. And then, after what felt like an eternity, he said the words that sealed Caldwell's fate. "Arrest him." The room shattered into chaos. Several high-ranking officers stood in shock, while others flinched as armed Secret Service agents stepped forward. Caldwell didn't resist. He just nodded once, his face unreadable, before allowing them to take his hands behind his back. Trump watched as his once loyal general, his friend, was led away. He should have felt vindicated. He didn't. Instead, there was only silence. And then, one voice broke it. "Mr. President?" Trump turned to see Agent Sarah Mitchell, the whistleblower who had risked everything to expose the truth. She was watching him carefully, as if studying him. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. Trump let out a slow breath. "No." Sarah swallowed hard, but nodded. "Neither am I." The two of them stood there, the weight of the moment pressing down on them like a mountain. And for the first time since this all began, Trump allowed himself a moment of exhaustion. He had won, but at what cost? The rot had been cut out. The deep state puppeteers had been exposed. But at the end of it all, he had lost one of the last people he thought he could trust. The battle wasn't over. But for now, it was time to pick up the pieces. As the sun began to rise over Washington, news of the arrests broke across every major media outlet. The headlines were bold. Deep state exposed. CIA officials arrested in massive treason scandal. President Trump's boldest move yet. The American people woke up to a different country. A cleansed country. A new era. And at the center of it all was Donald J. Trump. The sun had barely begun to rise over Washington, but inside CIA headquarters, the atmosphere was suffocating. The halls were eerily silent, despite the chaos that had erupted only hours earlier. General Caldwell, once one of the most respected men in the intelligence community, had been led away in handcuffs, his betrayal now exposed for the world to see. The deep rot within the agency had been cut out, but President Donald Trump knew this wasn't over. He stood at the center of the long conference room, his hands gripping the final list. The last names of those who had conspired in the shadows, who had sold out their country piece by piece. Deputy Director Mark Lawson, National Security Advisor James Callahan, and now even General Caldwell. They were all part of it. But there was one name still unchecked. The name at the very top of the list. Trump's jaw tightened as he turned to Agent Sarah Mitchell, the brave officer who had risked everything to expose the truth. She stood by his side, her eyes flickering with exhaustion, but her stance was firm. She had been fighting this war long before Trump had stepped into the building. "Sarah," Trump said, his voice low but steady, "there's one more person left." She nodded, already knowing what he was about to say. "James Callahan." A hush fell over the room. James Callahan, Trump's own national security advisor. The man who had stood beside him during every major decision. The man who had whispered in his ear about threats both foreign and domestic. The man who had vowed loyalty to the country, to the people, to Trump himself. And yet, he had been orchestrating it all. The deception, the cover-ups, the disappearances. Trump turned to his chief security officer. "Where is Callahan?" The agent hesitated before responding. "Sir, he left the premises before we initiated the arrests. We believe he knew this was coming." A sharp silence cut through the room. Callahan had fled. The betrayal cut deeper than Trump had expected. It wasn't just the agency that had been compromised. It was his own inner circle. Trump took a slow, measured breath. Find him. The command was simple, but its weight was crushing. Sarah's expression hardened. "Sir, if he's on the run, he won't go quietly. He knows too much." Trump's gaze darkened. "Then we don't give him the chance." The next few hours were a blur of intelligence briefings, security updates, and frantic reports from field agents. Callahan had vanished. His home was empty, his phones disconnected. Surveillance footage showed him leaving his office just minutes before the operation at the CIA had begun. He had known. He had planned for this. Trump paced inside the Situation Room, his mind racing. Callahan wouldn't just disappear. He was too powerful for that. He had spent years manipulating the system, bending the government to his will. If he was on the run, it meant he had somewhere to go. Sarah stood nearby, scanning through intelligence reports. We intercepted an encrypted message sent from Callahan's phone before he disappeared. Trump's head snapped toward her. What does it say? Sarah hesitated before reading the message aloud. Initiating silent exit. Rendezvous at the nest. Trump's pulse quickened. The nest? Sarah's face paled. Sir, that's the code name for a CIA safe house. Trump's blood ran cold. The man had an escape plan. And worse, he had resources inside the government helping him. Trump turned to his security detail. Get me a team. We move now. The convoy of black SUVs sped through the winding roads of rural Virginia, headlights piercing through the early morning mist. Inside the lead vehicle, Trump sat in silence, his expression unreadable. This wasn't just about exposing corruption anymore. This was personal. They arrived at a remote, heavily guarded compound, the Nest. It was a CIA-run facility, a place where high-level assets were taken when their lives were in danger. Or, in Callahan's case, when they needed to disappear. Armed Secret Service agents moved into position, surrounding the compound. Trump stepped out of the SUV, his presence commanding. He had come to finish this himself. Sarah approached, speaking into her earpiece. Thermal scans show multiple armed guards inside. Callahan isn't alone. Trump exhaled sharply. Then we go in fast. The order was given. Agents breached the compound, weapons drawn. The first room was cleared, then the second, then the third. And then, they found him, James Callahan. He stood inside a dimly lit command center, flanked by 2 armed operatives. But he wasn't running. He wasn't panicking. He was smiling. Trump entered the room, his gaze locked onto the man who had once been his trusted advisor. Mr. President, Callahan said smoothly, as if they were meeting over coffee instead of inside a fortified safe house. I was expecting you. Trump didn't blink. Stand down, Callahan. It's over. Callahan chuckled. Is it? A slow, unsettling silence settled over the room. Then, the monitors behind Callahan flickered to life. Video feeds, documents, names, information that no one outside the highest levels of intelligence should have had access to. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Sir, those files. Callahan smirked. That's right. He gestured to the screens. I have everything. Every secret the government has ever buried. Every classified operation. Every deal. Every cover-up. Every war. Trump's hands curled into fists. Callahan tilted his head. You think you've won? That you can just arrest me and the corruption disappears? He took a slow step forward. Let me tell you something, Mr. President. His voice dropped to a whisper. I am the system. Trump didn't flinch. He simply stared at Callahan, measuring him. Then, in one swift motion, Trump raised his hand. Take him. Secret Service agents rushed forward, tackling Callahan to the ground. He struggled, cursing, thrashing, but it was over. The moment the cuffs snapped around his wrists, Trump leaned down, his voice low but deadly. The system is broken, Callahan, and I just tore it apart. By sunrise, James Callahan was in federal custody. The last name on the list, the final piece of the conspiracy, had fallen. Trump stood outside CIA headquarters, watching the sun rise over the nation's capital. The battle had been won. But he knew this was only the beginning. Sarah approached, standing beside him. We did it. Trump exhaled. No. He turned to her, his gaze hard, determined. Now we rebuild. The weight of the night's events still hung thick in the air as President Donald Trump stood at the heart of CIA headquarters, his gaze steady, his mind sharper than ever. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. The shadow network that had ruled from the dark for decades had finally been exposed, its leaders arrested, its plans unraveled. But as the dust settled, Trump knew this was only the beginning. The agency had been fractured by corruption, its very foundation shaken to its core. And now, the hardest part lay ahead. Rebuilding, restructuring, and ensuring that treachery like this would never infiltrate the U.S. intelligence system again. Standing beside him was Agent Sarah Mitchell, the woman who had risked everything to bring the truth to light. She had been silenced for years, threatened and outcast by the very people who had once sworn to protect the country. But tonight, she had won. "Sir," she said quietly, her voice filled with cautious relief. "It's over." Trump shook his head, his jaw tightening. "No, Sarah, it's not." Her brow furrowed. "Sir?" Trump turned, looking around at the remaining CIA officers in the briefing room. Some of them stood in silence, still in shock from the revelations that had unfolded before them. Others watched him with a new sense of loyalty, of purpose. Trump stepped forward, his voice steady but filled with unwavering authority. "For years, these walls have harbored traitors. These halls have echoed with deception. I stood here tonight and uncovered the corruption that has rotted this agency from the inside out." He paused, letting his words sink in. The room was deathly silent. "But now we rebuild." Sarah's eyes widened. "Sir, what do you mean?" Trump turned to face the entire intelligence team, his eyes burning with determination. "We are cleaning house, and it starts today. Every single person in this room has a choice. You stand with America or you stand against it. There is no in-between." A few officers shifted uncomfortably. They had spent their careers under a broken system, and now, for the first time, they were being held accountable. Trump raised his chin. "If you have any reservations, any doubts about your allegiance, I suggest you resign now. Because I swear to you, there will be no second chances." A tense silence filled the room. No one moved. Then, slowly, an officer in the back stepped forward. "Mr. President," his voice was strong, unwavering, "I stand with you, and I stand with America." Another officer followed, then another, and another. One by one, the room came alive with voices pledging loyalty, officers standing tall in defiance of the corruption that had once ruled them. Trump nodded, his face unreadable, but behind that stoic expression, there was something else. Hope. As the room settled, Trump turned back to Sarah, who still held the final files, the last remnants of evidence that had shattered the intelligence community. "Get these declassified," Trump ordered. "The American people deserve to know the truth." Sarah hesitated. "Sir, are you sure? This will shake the country." Trump's eyes darkened. "Good. The press would go wild. The establishment would fight back. The political elites would call it reckless. But the people? The people would finally see the government for what it had been, a house of lies that had finally been burned to the ground." Sarah exhaled sharply, nodding. "It will be done, sir." Trump turned to his security detail. "Ensure that every agent remaining in this agency is fully vetted. I want background checks, past communications, financial records, everything. If there's even a hint of corruption, they're gone." A chorus of affirmations filled the room. The old system was dead, and in its place, something stronger, something unshakable would rise. Sarah looked at Trump, a small smirk forming on her lips. "You really aren't done, are you?" Trump chuckled, shaking his head. "Not even close." By the time dawn broke over Washington, D.C., the world was already on fire. News networks scrambled to cover the biggest government shakeup in American history. TA director arrested for treason. Massive intelligence purge underway. Trump takes on the deep state and wins. The headlines were everywhere. The public was in shock. For decades, people had whispered about a hidden power, about a system that worked against the interests of America rather than for it. Now, they had proof. Protests broke out, some in support, others in fear. But the truth was undeniable. Trump had done what no other president had dared to do. Inside the White House, Trump sat in the Oval Office, watching the world react to the truth. His phone buzzed, an incoming call. "Sir," his chief of staff's voice was tense, "there are calls coming in from world leaders. Some are not happy." Trump smirked. "Good, that means we did something right." He leaned back in his chair, the weight of the past 24 hours pressing against him. But he wasn't tired. No, he was just getting started. Sarah stood in the doorway, arms crossed. "So what now, sir?" Trump exhaled, looking at the sunrise over the Capitol. Then, with a grin, he said, Now we take America back. This story is more than just a political shakeup. It is a reminder of the power of truth and the courage it takes to expose corruption. President Donald Trump's bold move to cleanse the intelligence community of betrayal was not just about politics. It was about restoring the American people's faith in their government. In today's world, transparency and accountability are more important than ever. Corruption thrives in the shadows, and those who dare to challenge it face relentless opposition. But as this story proves, one leader with the will to fight can make all the difference. This isn't just about the past, it's about the future. It's about ensuring that those who wield power do so in service to the people, not in secret alliances against them. If you believe in standing up for the truth, if you believe in fighting for justice, then help spread this message. Like, subscribe, and share this video so that more people wake up to the reality of what's happening behind closed doors. The battle for America's future isn't over, but together, we can win.